being 5:30, the House will now proceed to the consideration by private members' business as listed on today's order paper. Orders of the day, ordre du jour.
Orders of the day, private members' business, consideration at second reading of Bill C-234, Bank of Canada Accountability Act, standing in the name of Mr. Scheer.
Mr. Scheer, seconded by Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West, moves that Bill C-253, an act to amend the Bank of Canada Act and to make consequential amendments to other acts, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Finance. Debate. The honourable member for Regina Capel.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it is truly an honour to rise today and speak to my private member's bill, the Bill C-253, which is being called the Bank of Canada Accountability Act. Now, Madam Speaker, you may know that the Auditor General is empowered under the Auditor General's Act to perform audits of government agencies and departments. However, there is a special carve-out. There is an exemption in the Financial Administration Act which specifically excludes the Bank of Canada from the oversight that the Auditor General provides. We're all familiar with Auditor General's reports. It's always a big day on Parliament Hill when the Auditor General tables a report after investigating on behalf of Canadians into various departments, agencies, and programs. Of course, it was the Auditor General's report back many years ago that first brought to light the excessive expenses of the long gun registry. And it was thanks to her work that, at the time, that Canadians got to know the billion-dollar price tag of that useless and ineffective program. We can all think to times when the Auditor General has identified massive problems with the government's handling of everything from immigration protocols to transportation. And that is what this bill is all about, bringing the Bank of Canada into line with other departments and agencies to provide that oversight, so the Auditor General is empowered to do the same types of audits that he or she does on all other agencies and departments. Now, many in the Liberal establishment are opposed to this bill. The Prime Minister once said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And then he ran around pulling the shades down on all the windows to keep things hidden. And he's afraid of accountability and transparency now. In fact, he's so allergic to it that he's made a deal with the NDP to help cover things up at committees and in the House. So it's not a surprise why Liberal parliamentarians and Liberal politicians are opposed to this bill, but Canadians are demanding this type of accountability and oversight. They're demanding it because we're seeing unprecedented action by the Bank of Canada, unprecedented decision-making that is directly affecting the value of the money that they've worked so hard to earn. So many of the arguments against this bill that I've already heard through the corporate media and the taxpayer-subsidized media, the government-subsidized media, and Liberal politicians are all bogus. You know, first of all, one of the critiques is that the bank is already audited. Well, that is true. The bank is already audited by firms, private sector firms in Canada. But those are not the same types of audits that the Auditor General does. The Auditor General doesn't just simply do a balance sheet audit, Madam Speaker. It's not like the Auditor General just goes in and tallies up everything on the left side of the ledger and makes sure it balances out with everything on the right side of the ledger. No one's assuming that someone's leaving the Bank of Canada with bags of cash over their shoulder. What the Auditor General does, in addition to balance sheet audits, are performance audits. And that's really the whole point of this bill. The Bank of Canada has made many, many decisions that have had a profound negative impact on Canadians. They decided, for example, to buy corporate bonds. They had a corporate bond purchasing program. Now, if you go to their website, they spell out some of the general criteria of what minimum thresholds companies would have to meet in order to have their bonds purchased by the bank. And we should point out, Madam Speaker, that it is a huge advantage to a company to have their bonds purchased by the central bank. A bond is basically an IOU. It's debt. It's a company saying we don't have the money today, but loan it to us now, and we'll pay you back later. And corporations have to pay for that. They have to pay interest on those bonds. Now, when fewer people are willing to buy the bonds, those corporations have to raise their interest rate to sweeten the deal, to attract more potential buyers. And that costs the corporation more money. When the Bank of Canada comes along and says, no, we'll buy some of those bonds, well, that's a huge benefit to the corporation who's selling the bonds. Which bonds did the Bank of Canada buy? Why did they buy a bond from Company A and not Company B? Those are the types of things that we don't know. We don't know all the criteria that led into the decision making. It could very well be that in very competitive marketplaces, say the airline industry, that one airline's bonds were purchased by the bank and another one wasn't. In the telecommunications sector, the same thing. Perhaps one company's bonds were bought and another not. And let's be clear, they're not buying these bonds with their own money. The Bank of Canada creates money. So when they buy these corporate bonds, they're creating new money right out of thin air, which has an impact on the purchasing power of the money that Canadians have worked so hard to earn. In fact, it dilutes that every time they create new money. In addition to the corporate bonds, Madam Speaker, they've been buying government bonds, and boy, have they ever. They've been on a buying spree for almost 2 years. From the beginning of the pandemic, when the Prime Minister ran out of other people's money to borrow, he had to turn to the Bank of Canada. And the Bank of Canada was only too happy to oblige. The Bank of Canada, since about April of 2020, has been bankrolling the Prime Minister's deficit spending to the tune of about $400 billion, Madam Speaker. $400 billion of new money created right out of thin air. That's what's causing the inflation today. And that's why Canadians have a right to know what the bank was doing, what criteria they were following, and report back to Parliament and ultimately to Canadians. We've never seen this type of intervention in our monetary policy in our nation's history. You know, back in the great global recession of 2008, the previous Conservative government held the line on monetary policy. It was a difficult time. Many of my colleagues were in the House at that time. A lot of difficult decisions had to be made. But the previous Conservative government understood that if you start to print money out of thin air, you're making the already difficult situation even worse. And that's what we're seeing today. Coming out of the pandemic, after 2 years of hardship, after the emotional toll that it took on Canadians individually, people who had to go long periods of time without seeing their loved ones, so many small business owners watching their entire life's work evaporate as restrictions prevented them from opening their doors and serving their customers. Now, coming out of that, Canadians are being faced with punitive rates of inflation. Things that were costing $10 or $12 are now going for $18, $20. You know, you almost need to get a pre-approval on a new loan to go grocery shopping these days when you see the prices just escalating. Tools, lumber, all types of everyday purchases that Canadians make are just going up and up. And the government would have you believe that this is just like something that happens. Like it's like the weather. Hey, we're going through an unexpected cloudy period and oh, inflation is up a little bit this quarter. That's nonsense, Madam Speaker. Inflation doesn't just happen. It is a direct result of the monetary policy of the Bank of Canada working hand in hand with the government of the day. And that's why this act is so necessary. We need to restore the independence of the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada's independence has been undermined by this government's decisions to bankroll its deficit spending with all that new money creation. That's why prices are going up today. It's actually rather simple. If you have the same number of goods, but you dramatically increase the amount of dollars that are going around, prices will go up. It's not rocket science. In fact, it's basic laws of economics. More dollars chasing fewer goods equals inflation. That's precisely what we're seeing today. Now, the government will try to have you believe that inflation is happening because of external factors. Remember when they tried to blame the war in Ukraine? They tried to blame inflation on Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Well, guess what, Madam Speaker? Inflation was happening long before the invasion of Ukraine. The previous summer, on the eve of the election, inflation was already ticking up to record levels. And we all remember the famous quote that the Prime Minister said in the middle of an election, when inflation was only at about 4%. Remember those days? Remember when inflation was only as bad as 4%? And our party started to challenge the Prime Minister on this and started to challenge the Liberals and to highlight to Canadians that it was their economic policy that was causing the inflation. And what did the Prime Minister come back with? He said, "You'll forgive me if I don't think about monetary policy." Well, we don't forgive him, Madam Speaker. He should think about monetary policy. I guess he doesn't understand it, otherwise he would know that he's to blame for all that inflation. They try to say that it can't be the Prime Minister's fault. Yes, there's inflation in Canada, but there's inflation in other countries too. That is true, Madam Speaker. Other countries that made the same foolish decisions to run the printing presses during a time of economic contraction are also experiencing record levels of inflation. Some countries didn't do that. There are several countries around the world that preserved the value of their currency and are not experiencing the same punitive levels of inflation that Canadians are having to pay. Their argument is a little bit like if someone said to me, "You know, Andrew, you're putting on a little bit of weight. You know, member for Regina Capel, you're putting on a little bit of weight. You might want to look at your eating habits." And if I said, "Well, hey, obesity is a North American problem. You know, obesity rates around North America are the real challenge. It can't be anything I do because I live in a continent where it's a challenge for a lot of people." No, of course not. Of course not. It's because of the decisions of each individual, just like it's the decisions of each individual country that is causing all the inflation we're seeing today. At the end of the day, the dollars that we carry around with us, the ones and zeros in our bank accounts, it has no intrinsic value. You can't do much with a $20 bill or a $100 bill. The only reason why other people accept it as payment is because there's a level of trust. There's a level of trust that someone else will accept it as payment and give the same value that was received. When the Bank of Canada undermines that trust by creating all that money, washing through our system, it devalues the value of the money that people work so hard. It's a form of fraud. If someone agrees to provide labor to an employer for a given salary, and then at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, the money that they receive for the work that they've given is worth less, they've been defrauded of what they've agreed to. They can't go back and take away 6 to 10% of their labor. They can't go back and say, "Well, the dollars that you paid me with are now worth less, so I'd like some of my time and energy back." They can't do that. They've already given that to their employer, and the money that they've received is now worth less than what they agreed to. That is why inflation is the worst form of tax. But of course, governments love inflation. Governments love inflation because it makes the debt that they've accumulated easier to pay off. Inflation is great for people who have the ability to borrow, and that's what we saw during this whole pandemic. As the Bank of Canada washed all that money through the system, the people that got the money first got to buy things before prices went up. So these large financial institutions and investors who have that access to that early money first, they were able to accumulate all the assets. And by the time the rest of us get the money through wage increases and other phenomena, prices have already gone up, and those wealthy investors get to sell at record profits. That's why there have been such big winners during this last 2 years. That's why when you look at the stock markets, just go and check what bank shares have done in the last 2 years. Bank shares have gone up dramatically since the start of the pandemic. And when you look at the Bank of Canada's balance sheet and you look at the money supply charts that, when you factor in all the money in Canada, everything from the ones and zeros in your bank account, the digital money that we all have in our checking and savings account, when you look at the cash, when you look at all the various credit products that exist out there, when you factor that all together, the rate of increase in the money supply tracks almost identically with the balance sheet at the Bank of Canada. That's what this bill is all about, Madam Speaker. It's about providing the first steps towards accountability and transparency so that Canadians can have their confidence in the Bank of Canada restored. The independence of the Bank of Canada has been undermined by the political decisions of this Prime Minister. And if we want to get our finances under control, if we want to get the value of the money that we've worked so hard to earn stable, We need this first step in accountability so we can understand what the decision-making process was and what the costs were to Canadians. One other final point, Madam Speaker. You're going to hear arguments from the opposite benches about why this bill will undermine the Bank of Canada's independence. In fact, quite the contrary. The Bank of England is subject to parliamentary oversight through their equivalent of the Auditor General. The Bank of New Zealand, the Federal Reserve Bank of New Zealand, also has the same types of audit provisions that I am proposing here today. The European Union Central Bank has similar types of provisions with its version of the Auditor General. In fact, Canada is a bit of an outlier in the fact that it is allowing its central bank, which has so much enormous power on our economy, to be excluded from this oversight. This bill is long overdue, and I hope all members of the House will support it.